of the book. Hello and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Mayor and Festival founder Judd Ashman, your host for this morning's GBF presentation. Before we get started, a quick plug to support today's authors by purchasing their books, not just from anywhere, but from our wonderful bookseller partners at Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. We have links to the books in the description. And I'll note that given all we've been through over the past year, it is so important to support local jobs and the local economy. More on that later. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Now let's get started. Today we have two outstanding nonfiction writers, keen observers of American society, who both have books chronicling recent major disruptions in American life. Historian Garrett Peck, author of 8 books and a many-time popular presenter at our festival, joins us to speak about his latest, A Decade of Disruption, America in the New Millennium. It's an eye-opening history of the turbulent first decade of the 21st century, which you'll recall was bookended by 2 financial crises, the dot-com meltdown followed by the Great Recession. Banks deemed too big to fail were rescued by the federal government, while at the same time, millions lost their homes to foreclosure and witnessed the wipeout of their retirement savings. The fallout from the Great Recession led to the hyper-polarized society of the years that followed. The political populism on both the left and the right arose, which of course set the table for the Trump presidency, which our next guest, Carlos Lozada, examines in his book, What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. In his work as a book critic, Lozada read something like 150 volumes claiming to diagnose why Donald Trump was elected and what his presidency revealed about our nation. Lozada takes that a step further, asking the question, what do all these books and narratives tell us about how we understand ourselves at this point in history? Carlos Lozada is the nonfiction book critic for the Washington Post. He's been with us at GBF several times, but this is the first time he's been with us since he won a Pulitzer Prize. That's a pretty remarkable achievement, and we're delighted to welcome him back. Moderating the conversation today is Bradley Graham, who many in our community know as the co-owner of our beloved bookseller partner, Politics and Prose, and maybe some know as a member of the board of the American Booksellers Association. What you may not know is that bookselling is a second career for Brad. Before this, he spent 3 decades as a reporter at the Washington Post, covering mostly foreign and national security matters. As I turn it over to the panel, the only regret I have is that we're not doing this in person, and we can get a chance to host all of you on site again in the near future. For now, big welcome to Garrett Peck, Carlos Lozada, and Bradley Graham.
You know, whenever I do these Zoom talks, I always like to find out first where people are actually Zooming from, because I don't want to take anything for granted. I know you both normally live locally, but Garrett, where are you calling from, and Carlos, where are you today?
Well, and hello everyone, and thank you for your support of the Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm actually at the moment I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm in the process of moving out here, so looking for housing right now, which is kind of a crazy real estate market.
And I'm in Miami, Florida, visiting my parents down here. The lovely kids in the pictures behind me are my niece and nephew, not my own.
Well, I envy both of you. I'm here in Bethesda, which is my home. But through the magic of Zoom, we're all joined together. Now, you both have written very ambitious books this time. One analyzes and distills a whole decade, and the other analyzes and distills 150 books. How did each of you get the idea to undertake these projects? Garrett, we can start with you.
Okay, cool. My inspiration for my book started in 2007 when Jonathan Yardley of the Washington Post, he did this whole series of reviews when he looked back on literature from the past and stuff that really had stood the test of time. And in that year, he re-reviewed Frederick Lewis Allen's Only Yesterday, an informal history of the 1920s. And I read that book and I was just blown away by how cool it was. And immediately I had this idea, wow, I could do something like that for the time we're currently living in. So in the fall of 2007, I just started taking notes. As it turns out, this is right during the housing bubble bursting. And then, the following fall, 2008, is when the Great Recession really kicked in, which was really terrifying. And I was just taking notes all throughout the whole process. So that was pretty cool. I'm kind of doing the same thing here, by the way, about the pandemic. So I've got 110,000 words already written in Word, just a journal, a daily journal about how we're living during this time,
I'll look forward to that book too. And how about you, Carlos?
By the way, my favorite thing about these festivals is that I immediately pick up more ideas for books to read, and I think I have to go back and read that one. I was honored to succeed Jonathan Yardley in this role after he retired. So I love that origin story of your book, Garrett. Mine began really accidentally. I began reviewing books for the Washington Post right around the same time that Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency. And so first I decided, well, I'm going to read some books, some of Trump's own books, to see what they say about him. And then suddenly he's doing well in the polls, and you see these books coming out about the white working class and such. So I'm like, well, I'm going to review those and see what they say about Trump supporters. And then he wins, and there's resistance books. And so, well, I'm going to review those and see what they are saying. And that's when it hit me that this was my beat. This is what I was going to be doing, trying to understand the moment we're in through its kind of ongoing rapid fire literature. And originally I just meant to do that as a critic for the Washington Post. And it was probably after the midterm elections in 2018, maybe early the following year, when I started thinking about how can I try to put all this together and maybe take a more systematic look at the books of this time. I thought I would just write about it for the Washington Post, and I started drafting a piece, and I realized right away that it would take me, there were two things. First, I had much more to say than I could say in a Sunday piece for the Washington Post, but second, I had much more to read, and I knew there were many books that I'd missed along the way and books that were coming, so I decided to put it all together in a book project that's a book of books.
The other kind of origin story that often intrigues me is where the title comes from. So, Garrett, decade of disruption. I mean, you could have picked a number of other words to sum up the decade of turbulence, for instance. So why disruption?
It was actually not the original title of the book. The original title was The Lost Decade. And because of just two different economic meltdowns that occurred during this time, and so many lost opportunities and so on. And I'd also had in the introduction, I described what else this decade could have been described as or named. And it was really interesting. From the publisher, they came back and said, especially the salespeople, they're like, people keep getting confused with this with the 1920s. And in fact, that was a good critique, I think, because they kept saying, I'd say to my friends, I'm writing about the lost decade, and people would say, oh, you're writing about the 1920s. And I'm like, no, that's the lost generation. This is different. This is the the very first decade. So they asked if we could change the title, and I said, yeah, let's. Well, I had a list of other ones, and was like, let's go with A Decade of Disruption. And of course, I think that was very good timing because, of course, we're sitting in the grandmother or grandfather of all disruptions. I mean, the pandemic, which has disrupted every single person's life on this earth.
Right. We just finished a presidential term by the great disruptor. So it fits in a number of ways. And Carlos, your title could take either a question mark or an exclamation point at the end. Depending, I guess, on a reader's frame of mind. How did that come about? Yes,
which is why I wanted no punctuation with it. I wanted to be very open-ended. So I had, it's funny, I hadn't really thought about the title of the book, and I also had all these kind of half-baked ideas for titles that, in discussions with the publisher and with my agent, sort of no one liked. Everyone liked titles that I didn't like or they didn't like mine. And so I was really at wit's end, and I just reached out to a few colleagues, people in publishing or in journalism, and on email, and said, okay, look, here's like 2 paragraphs summing up my book. Here's all the titles I have in mind. Give me some suggestions. Like have at it. And I wasn't crazy about anything. And then literally the last weekend before we really had to finalize something to get kind of promotional materials out, I sent it to 2 funny writers at the Washington Post, Alex Petri and Dana Milbank. And I said, okay, guys, you guys have to help me out, And Dana instantly responded with, what were they thinking? And I thought, that's it, that's perfect. I just wanted it to be we. I didn't want it to be accusatory. I wanted it to kind of include all of us. And the only thing I was adamant about is that it would have no question mark and no exclamation point, no punctuation, because I want it to be both things. I want it to be both, what were we thinking in this kind of exasperated way, but also very straight. The book is about what we were thinking during this period through the prism of books by academics, by journalists, by insiders, by activists. And so I think I like it more every day. And so I really have Dana Milbank to thank for that.
You know, this is your first book, right, Carlos? And I think, Garrett, this is your eighth. So, Carlos, you know, what was it like the first time through?
You know, I worry that this is going to make me far too sympathetic to authors, and I'll never again be able to write a tough review of anyone's book, because it was arduous. You know, at first I was like, oh, it'll be like my longest pieces, just longer, right? And of course, it's not like that at all. And I was lucky because I had been thinking about these things for about 5 years, leading up to the moment when I decided to write it. And so I had all this kind of raw material of books I'd read and reviews I'd written, but I knew that there were, you know, if it's about 150 books, I'd say that maybe 90 were books I'd already read and 60 were books I just read for this project. And it was a much more intense experience than I imagined. I had a great editor at Simon & Schuster who kept telling me just to relax, that, you know, the first chapters would be the hardest until I got into a good rhythm. And so it was terrifying, and there were many moments when I thought that, you know, this is going nowhere, and why did I even attempt this? But
the only authors who has ever
oh, of course, no one's ever. And now I come off all sage and I tell new authors, like, oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. But it was a wonderful writing experience for me. I think I grew a lot as a writer, and just working with different editors as well is always helpful. And I think I was able to take the best from my editors at the Post and my editors at the publisher, and come up with something that kind of felt like a distillation of all of that.
So you think it will influence your criticism now?
I kind of think it has to. You know, I don't know exactly how. I'm very bad at sort of analyzing myself. I'll leave that to someone else to decide if it's changed the way I approach criticism. But I certainly have, I think, a lot more appreciation for even all the kind of little busy work that goes into producing a book, and not just, you know, sitting down and thinking your big thoughts. But there's so many small decisions along the way, things that you take for granted as a reader or as a reviewer about, you know, the organization of the book and what to include, what not to include. There's full chapters that could have been part of this book that weren't, issues that I chose to grapple with versus others. And you realize how everything is a choice. Everything in a book is a small or big choice. And so I think that appreciation will probably, I hope, make me give me a sharper eye for some of the decisions behind the structure and focus of the books that I review.
I'd been a reporter for about two decades before I did my first book, and one of the hardest things for me was, you know, I'd gotten used to writing long pieces, of course, but doing a book is a whole nother order of magnitude, and it was really hard for me once I got into it to remember what I had written earlier, you know, to have it, because I was so accustomed to keeping everything in my mind about what I had said. So I'd get to a new chapter towards the middle or later in the book, and I remember thinking, well, haven't I already said this, or how did I phrase it before, you know? And so just that was a whole, I had to really kind of redo my mind here to try to.
If I can hop in for a moment, I had that. My biggest concern was similar. I remember asking my editor, like, please save me from contradicting myself in chapter 7 versus what I said in chapter 3, you know, because I think of the chapters as these discrete entities, and yet, you know, they're not read that way. They have to flow. And I was terrified that I was going to somehow contradict myself, you know, from one idea to another. So the last read was like that, just to make sure that there weren't little things, discrepancies. You know, repetition probably somewhat inevitable, but the discrepancies is what I was really scared about.
So Garrett, so you're now a veteran author, right? After eight books. So how was writing this one similar or different from your previous books?
Yeah, this is actually the longest book I worked on. This took 13 years to get it out because I started it back in 2007, and not even knowing I was going to initially write a book, but it's kind of turned into that. I do think it does get easier with time. Part of it, of course, is just the editing process in your own head. As you're collecting the information, every author, you're going to end up with this huge list of content. And of course, you cannot publish it all. So you have to be able to really distill it down to something much more smaller, readable, has to have a flow. You have to be able to tell a story. And so I think with time, you get better at that. I really do believe that. So there's a phrase I do like to use. It's you have to be like Medea and kill your own children sometimes. So just deciding what content to leave in, and okay, this is not really rumor. That's just a non sequitur. Okay, I'm going to cut that out. You can put it on a blog post, or you save it for something else over time. But what I liked about this book, the process of writing it, I really tried to write each chapter as if it were kind of like a magazine article, a lengthy article. And I tell people, hey, you can really, even though it does unfold chronologically, but really you can follow whatever order you want, depending on the topic that you want, because each chapter tells a different narrative and a different aspect of the decade's history. So I encourage people, hey, jump around if you like. If you want to read about the new retirement, how people are living today into their 80s, et cetera, you can start there. About gay marriage, I read about that as well. And so
each chapter in your book does stand alone, but you had a whole decade of events to sift through, and in some cases you did pick sort of discrete events. In other cases, you have sort of trends. Talk a little bit about your methodology in deciding what you included and what you didn't include, and what you made a whole chapter about or not.
Yeah. Ultimately, it was I looked at things, especially in hindsight, as we look in the rearview mirror and decide, okay, what really resonated with us, either culturally, politically, economically, and then other things were like, okay, that's kind of passed by, And other things, especially in hindsight, of course, there's some things you would change. I did include, just one paragraph about the pandemic in 2009. I think a lot of people forget we actually had a pandemic that year. Hindsight, of course, I probably would have put a couple paragraphs about it, but it wasn't a huge deal in American society back in 2009 because
but you're
we dealt with it fairly
right? You're doing a whole new book about the pandemic, so it's like you gotta make up for your sin of leaving it out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny. We weren't talking about a whole lot. We were dealing with the outcome from the Great Recession in early 2009, and we did get a vaccine fairly quickly with that as well. So it didn't become this lockdown thing where mask wearing became politicized and whatnot, like you're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. And Carlos, you had to sift through 150 books, and I know you're very thorough. I've heard you talk about the way you do your reviews for the Washington Post. You take a lot of notes and read books through more than once. Mm-hmm. Did you do something similar for your book?
Yes, and I'm sort of pathetically old school. I have just like huge 3-ring binders with printed out notes for each chapter, and that when I was working on those chapters, I would kind of lug that binder back and forth. But here, I think a lot of it was a process of selection. That was the biggest issue. Once I decide, okay, I'm going to have a chapter on books about identity and those debates, or books about truth or immigration, then it becomes about selecting, maybe I've read 20, but only 12 are going to make it into the chapter. And similarly, there were whole subjects that, in hindsight, looking back on the Trump presidency, I would have wanted to include, right there, but there wasn't like a critical mass of books that were, out and ready with deep insights on the subject, like Trump's foreign policy and America First, what that really means, how that played out, I think is still being kind of excavated. I thought about a chapter on all the impeachment books, because of course there were impeachment books started coming out as soon as Trump was elected. Already there were books making the case for why he's going to be impeached. And I'm really glad that I, in the end, decided not to do that, because those books would have focused, of course, so heavily on the first impeachment, on the Mueller investigation and all that. And then, of course, we had a second one, after the election. And so it would have felt kind of hopelessly dated. That was the challenge, to not try to make the book so timely and so up to date that it would keep it from ever feeling timeless, feeling like a snapshot of the moment.
And the pandemic too, I think, right?
Yes, that was tricky. So my original deadline for the manuscript was, early 2020, I think like February or March. And then we were going to have a pub date of July. And just when I was supposed to hand in the manuscript, suddenly we all go on lockdown. The world changes mid-March. And so I begged the publisher, like, give me a few more weeks. I have to find ways to incorporate this into the book. What I wanted to avoid is that thing you see in a lot of books that are trying to be timely, that they just add a quickie chapter at the end, like, and here's a bunch of stuff that happened near the end of my reporting, right? And that's always, as a reader, it's always a little dissatisfying to me. And so I knew that I wanted to try to find different moments throughout the book where it would make sense to address some of that. There's a chapter on, Trump's management of the White House, a chapter on democracy, and the response to COVID would fit into a few of those different places. So I wanted to kind of weave it through the book. My next deadline was then literally just when the George Floyd video came into the world, and huge protests around the country. And I knew once again I had to address this throughout the book, and not just with a quick epilogue or something. So in the end, we ended up pushing the book from July to October. So it came out just about a month before the election. But that way I was able to address some of the momentous issues of Trump's final year in office, which I think both helped the book, and I think of this book just as a way to help me remember how I thought about this period. What was I thinking as I was absorbing all of this? And I'm glad I was able to include that as well.
Hey, Garrett, were there any particular books about the 2000s that you found especially useful in doing your book?
I went through most of the major literature of the 2000s, and it's an incredible list of books that came out during this time. There's a huge number of books that came out about the Bush administration. And surprisingly, I think George W. Bush's memoir was pretty good. And I think he was fairly circumspect about things, especially years later. There were other books, for example, Dick Cheney's memoir, which, as I called in the introduction, I ain't sorry for nothing, because he really was unapologetic about what the Bush administration had done. But there's lots of other books, for example, about the Great Recession, and all the major players wrote their memoirs. I think one of the most fascinating ones was by Michael Lewis, and that was The Big Short. And they turned that into a movie. That's a fantastic book. It really is quite good. But just looking back, there's so much great literature that came out of it, including the 9/11 Commission report, which was actually very well written. So there are a lot of books from that era that I get to delve into that went into my own book.
Yeah. Well, actually, speaking of Michael Lewis, that's Carlos, his book later, The Fifth Risk. That's one of your top 12 books, right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a big fan of his work ever since Liar's Poker. And The Fifth Risk, it came with a lot less hoopla than most Michael Lewis books, which, that they're coming and everything. This one kind of just arrived for me. I didn't even know that it was coming. And it's just to me, it was one of the most useful books of the last 5 years, in that, and especially, it was written before the pandemic, but I mean, before the pandemic, it was merely sort of, prescient. Now it just feels prophetic, because it looks at what happens to the workings of government when its expertise is consistently undermined and devalued, and how we sort of forget that government is in many ways this sort of massive risk mitigation exercise. That they're there to try to make it so that when bad stuff happens, we are somehow prepared. And he does it by looking at not sort of the sexy cabinet agency, not like defense and state and treasury, but the Department of Commerce and Agriculture and Energy, which most people don't necessarily know a lot about.
And which actually do a lot more than people realize.
Yes, yes. Sometimes more than the cabinet secretaries who are appointed realized. I think it surprised Rick Perry. The Department of Energy basically is about protecting nukes and not about oil drilling. But I tried to identify books like that instead of necessarily being some of the very good but really in the moment, look at all the crazy stuff happening books that we saw a lot of during the Trump presidency, starting with Fire and Fury, to books like Lewis's that I think were really helpful to help you understand what the impact of this administration was in sort of a long-term way. So I'm also a big fan, and I think that you mentioned, Garrett, that they become movies and all this. I think that the Obamas have picked up some kind of option or something for The Fifth Risk with their new production company. So who knows? We may see Department of Energy bureaucrats becoming heroes on television.
So Garrett, a basic premise, of course, of your book is that the events of the 2000s led to increased polarization, with America dividing into two separate political camps that, with little overlap. And this in turn, led in 2016 to the election of the ultimate disruptor, Donald Trump. Talk about that.
Yeah, and we certainly have been a divided society, probably at least since the Vietnam era. But I think things really, really quite sped up a great deal. And there's a number of factors in there. There's, of course, these endless wars that we've been fighting, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, if you look at Trump's followers, they tend to be, pro-military, pro-police, et cetera. And there's a small part of the country that provides most of the soldiers. It's 0.05% of the country. It's very, very small. And those people feel particularly upset about the endless war as I go on. I think another key factor is that the housing bubble, and once that finally burst, how much that injured so many different people across American society. And of course, the housing bubble collapse leads directly to the Great Recession. You won't have the Great Recession without the housing bubble collapse, and the fact that so many of the bankers nearly went out of business as well. And rescuing the banks was deeply, deeply unpopular. And of course, there was no rescue at all for the little guy, but there was for the bankers. But we learned that lesson from the Great Depression. Don't let your banks go out of business, otherwise your whole economy is going to collapse. So of course, that was deeply, deeply unpopular. And remember, this took place in the fall of 2008, right during the presidential campaign. And look what happens 2 weeks after Obama comes into office. The Tea Party is founded. I think it's both economic, but there's also a cultural factor going on. In 2008, the Commerce Department, so the Census Bureau, had issued this report basically saying, a forecast saying, okay, by the 2040s, white people will be the largest minority in the country. And for working class whites, that's a big deal because it's a huge loss of status for them. And all of a sudden we elect a black president, suddenly emblemizing how much society is now changing. And suddenly, whoa, loss of status for white people. And you kind of combine all of those things together, and the Tea Party is formed 2 weeks after Obama comes into office. And you can draw a direct line between the Tea Party and Trump supporters today. Basically, he co-opted the Tea Party, but without all the concerns about the deficit that the Tea Party had. So yeah, the Tea Party came in and they would not work with Obama. That was their mantra right there. Like, throw your shoes into the machine, stop compromising with Obama, and we will not work with that man. And we're not racist, basically, that's what they said. But obviously race was a factor in this. Absolutely.
Some of the events that you devote whole chapters to are clearly turning points, like 9/11 and the Iraq War and the Great Recession. But some aren't so much cataclysmic occurrences as sort of, more gradual societal changes. You have a chapter, for instance, on being gay in America, and another that you mentioned earlier that you call the new retirement. Why include something like retirement as a subject in the book?
There's a couple of reasons for that. I saw that personally, for example, with one of my parents who wanted to retire in 2001. And of course, then we had the dot-com meltdown, and suddenly that person ended up working for another decade because her 401k got hit really hard. So, and how we look at that throughout the decade, and I covered other issues as well. You remember Terri Schiavo, 2005, the woman who's hooked up to the machine? Mm-hmm. That's all part of the factors of what culturally is going on. I think much of the country looked at that and was sort of shocked, like, oh my gosh, you can keep a person alive forever that way. Everyone ran out and got their wills updated and got powers of attorney established because of that. It's all part of the thinking that was going on at the time. And even to this day, we have to consider, okay, we all have 3 decades longer to live than people did 100 years ago. That's astonishing how much longer we have. But there's that fear, of course, of running out of money for a lot of people before you run out of life. So I thought that was very important to include, because we were starting to see in that first decade, the baby boomers starting to retire. And that's a big deal because there's so many of them.
Now, Carlos, one of the basic premises, or I guess points of your book is that you really aren't particularly enamored about a lot of what was written about Trump and the Trump era, right? You argue that a lot of these books were just banged out quickly in order to sort of capture the mood of the moment or cash in on the outrage that was being felt. And so your book's not so much a rundown of the works out there about Trump and Trumpland as it is a broader sort of exploration of how we as a country have grappled with the Trump phenomenon. So talk about that.
You're right. It's a sort of a sort of broader critique that I'm trying to make here. And I really appreciate that we're putting these two books in conversation, because I feel that so much of what happened in the period that I am examining is really an outflow of the disruption that Garrett's describing that came before, and that polarization that was created. I mean, when Donald Trump is at the Republican convention, saying, "I am your voice, I speak for you," it's very clear who he's talking to, right? And it's not the country writ large. And that polarization, I think, is evident in a lot of the writing of the period, where Trump himself was such a disruptive force. It was so unexpected that even Trump's team didn't think he was going to win. That when he did, a lot of the thinkers and the writers kind of retreated to those comfort zones and to their corners of the boxing ring, and you see that come alive in their writing. Even journalists who I very much assume are writing in good faith, saw the same reality through very particular prisms. I mentioned, in fact, I start off the book with the story of this one guy named Ed Harry, who was a longtime Democrat. He was a delegate to the '92 convention that nominated Bill Clinton, the labor organizer from Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. And he's profiled in this book called The Great Revolt by Selena Zito, and paints him as a straight up economic populist, right? He's worried about trade deals, and he doesn't like political dynasties, and he thinks Democrats have forgotten the working man, so he becomes a Trump supporter, and that's the story. And I read that in sort of early 2018. Then later that year, many books in between that I'd read and reviewed, I'm reading another book by Ben Bradley Jr. called The Forgotten. And he profiles this guy who's a labor organizer, a longtime Democrat, '92 convention delegate who switched to Trump. And I'm like, how do I know this guy? How do I know? This is familiar. And it hit me. I went back and looked. It's the same guy. Now, the fascinating thing is that in the second book, he's a full-on culture warrior, right? He's concerned about, transgender people in bathrooms, and he thinks 9/11 was an inside job, all these. And maybe he changed dramatically in the span of a few months. People were radicalized in different ways over this period. But what was clear to me is that these differing interpretations of the same person really fit very well with the larger argument that each writer was making about why people supported Trump. For Zito, it was much more an argument about economic populism. For Bradley, it was much more an argument about sort of cultural anxieties and racial animus. And so to me, that signaled that, we're all susceptible to this, that I think, we end up seeing the world through very particular prisms. So the books that managed to break through that were the ones that really meant the most to me, or that showed that some of these problems are really much longer running. Trump did not invent our immigration problems or immigration debates. And a book like Erica Lee's America for Americans shows that alongside the tradition of America as a nation of immigrants, is a tradition of this, intense xenophobic strain in America as well. And those two things kind of can happen at the same time. Those two things go together. And so books that often gave me that long view, that showed me that Trump maybe is unique, and that he pulls so many of these disruptive forces together in one moment. But those larger debates are kind of ever present in the American story, and that helped me make sense of the time as well.
Garrett, you write about immigration and minorities, and in your book you have a whole chapter called "A Nation of Minorities." Talk about how that factored in the 2000s.
It's been a long-term, as Carlos just mentioned, it's been a long-term debate in our country about immigration and the role and how much you can upset the societal balance, et cetera. And I always liken it to a pendulum swinging back and forth. And you look back to the 1920s, where we slammed the gates shut against anyone who was not from Northwestern Europe. So they wanted white people to come into the country. And that lasted all the way until Lyndon Johnson, 1965, when he finally had an immigration reform bill. Then later on, Ronald Reagan had some immigration reform. And then George W. Bush actually was very much, and even to this day, has been a champion of immigrants. So, but the white working class base of the Republican Party does not want any more, because they see immigration as a threat to their status and also to their personal economics, that someone might be able to, an undocumented worker might be able to take their job, and so on. So, those of us who live in cities and are well educated, we're like, oh, yay, more great restaurants coming in, more great food we can try. Whereas for the working class, it's much more of an existential issue for them, and also a cultural issue, because they worry about being replaced. The biggest group that's coming in right now, of course, are Hispanics, and not necessarily from Mexico anymore, but more from Central America. That's been the big pulse here over the last few years. It makes it very, very difficult, of course. There's really no agreement on this issue in society. This has been going on for a while. Obama wasn't able to get the question settled. W couldn't get it settled. Biden would like to, but I don't have great hopes on this. So it's a tough question in American society, and it's a very relevant part of our cultural debate right now.
So we had this kind of political climax with Trump. We talked about how the trends through the 2000s, 2010s led to him and his presidency, but now we're beyond that, and we've got a president who's a healer and a calmer. At least that's how he presents himself. Okay, the nation's still divided, but Joe Biden is going to continue to try to bring us together. So what about all this end of democracy thinking?
Yeah, we certainly learned over the last few years that democracy is more fragile than we thought. I'm pleased that the guardrail is actually held. So, but yeah, it's a key factor there is the citizens themselves getting involved in their own government and deciding to vote. It's a key factor. But could Trump happen again? I wonder about that. I think in many ways he's a singular event, which we can certainly learn lessons from. But there certainly could be other populists that come out there, and we can obviously look at other fragile democracies. Germany in the 1920s and 1930s that elected Adolf Hitler legally in 1933. So yeah, it's all a little, become aware of how much more fragile our own democracy is, even as those institutions held and we managed to survive and get through these years with our democracy intact. But there are still more threats, whether it's from voter suppression or from outside forces that are trying to bring in propaganda through Facebook, et cetera. I mean, those are all factors that can possibly overturn our beloved apple cart here,
Carlos?
Yeah, I agree with Garrett that we've come to realize how fragile American democracy can be. I remember reading a book by Larry Diamond, one of the foremost thinkers on democracy, and he wrote this book a couple of years ago where he started off saying, "Look, I've spent all my time studying democratic breakdown around the world. It never occurred to me we'd have to worry about it here." Mm-hmm. And of course, the one thing, if there's one thing that people have learned during this period, it's that our democracy is as much guided by sort of generally accepted norms of conduct rather than by laws. Like norms has become one of the watchwords of the period. Like we're all at the bar at Cheers, like norms. It's what everyone remembers from this time. And so I think, that is useful. That is useful because, this kind of faith in the system, right? That something called the system is going to hold versus the people who make up the system at any given moment can be more or less protective of it. And so I think that's the great lesson. I don't know that we can, declare victory, that we're completely beyond this. I think it's fair to say that while both parties have moved in more sort of extreme directions, toward left or right, I think one party has radicalized more than the other, and I think it's very hard to have a democracy when there's debate over acceptance of basic facts. You can debate policies, but only with an agreed upon set of facts, and that's increasingly hard to do in a democracy. So I think what happens to the Republican Party, will be extremely important if you want to maintain a healthy democracy, which in this country has meant a healthy two-party system. So, I'm in awe of historians who can do what Garrett does to sort of excavate kind of recent near-term history, as opposed to like, well, I'm going to go tell you about Reconstruction again, because I think that's very difficult because so much of it seems still fluid and still in play and up for reinterpretation. So I appreciate books like that give us the tools to be able to understand where we are at this moment. I think it's sometimes very hard to see that your own 2 feet planted in the moment and have a sense of where you are. That's what I think I tried to do in the book. But I realized that I hope I don't have to write a volume 2, but I don't know that the Trump era is necessarily over in that sense.
What would you like to see a book about that you haven't yet? Carlos, why don't you take that one first, and then Garrett, you can answer.
I feel this is dangerous. I could tell publishers exactly what I want to review, well, and then I
could guide you a little bit, because you do say somewhere, right, some memoirs that you would like to see.
Yes. I do want to see memoirs, and I like what Garrett was saying about the memoirs that come out of the financial crisis. Were really important to understanding that period. I think there are some key participants in the big battles of this time that I want to hear from. Someone like Don McGahn, who was the White House counsel for Trump, whose primary focus seemed to be to help transform the judiciary in this country and get as many conservative judges appointed as he could. While he was working in that job, and he seemed to succeed, at it. I want to know more about that story. I want to hear from Kirstjen Nielsen, who was at the center of all these debates over family separation and border policy. I thought I wanted to hear from Robert Mueller, but I don't know that I do anymore. I think I'm kind of Mullered out. And I think also, just selfishly, I think an Anthony Fauci memoir that doesn't just cover COVID, but covers what has been an extraordinary career at the intersection of kind of science and Washington. It could be a very interesting story. That's a story that is always very complicated in American life, the relationship between science and politics. And so I would love to hear it from his vantage point. A book I'd love to read is on Trump's relationship with evangelicals, and a really deep dive into how that worked. Selfishly, I'd like a lot of books on that, and I would add another chapter to a further edition of my book.
Garrett?
Yeah, I'm right there with you about Anthony Fauci. I think not only would love to see him write a memoir, I think he's worthy of a biography. I really do, because he has such a long history, dating back to the 1980s when he confronted the HIV/AIDS crisis, which is, he's been there since then in the same position, which is just remarkable. And I think he's an important figure in American history. I really do. Other books I would like to see. I'm always kind of startled how few books came out of the Obama administration. The Bush administration, oh my gosh, everyone wrote a memoir. In part, it's defensive. They're trying to defend what they had done over the time. And Obama finally got the first edition of his book out, part one. Finally, way overdue. But there's not that much literature that comes out of the Obama administration. I'm really surprised by that fact. So I really had to rely upon other sources. I had a chapter on Obama really dealing with the first 2 years of his administration. And there's just not that much actually came out of that administration. So I'd like to see more.
Well, from the lips of both of you to the ears of publishers, let's hope they're listening. I want to thank you both for taking time to do this. Each of your books really helps us understand the periods that you write about and the issues that you write about. So congratulations. And I think Judd's going to pop up here to say goodbye.
Here I am. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation and just an amazing way to kick off the 2021 Gaithersburg Book Festival. I want to thank each of you, Garrett Peck, Carlos Lozada, Bradley Graham. Thank you, and we hope we'll have you back soon. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. Basically, got to save the date for the whole month. You don't want to miss any of it. Please go to GaithersburgBookFestival.org and look over the schedule so you can plan the rest of your festival month. And before you go, we have a special message for you from the beloved author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog, Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.